There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless, upright. He feared God. He turned away from evil. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "Whence have you come?" Satan answered, "From going to and fro on earth, from walking up and down." And the Lord said to Satan, "Well, have you considered my servant Job, that there's none like him on the earth? He's blameless, he's upright, and he fears God. He turns away from evil. He still holds fast his integrity, although you moved me against him to destroy him with cause." Then Satan answered the Lord, "Is skin for skin. All that a man has he will give for his life, but put forth your hand and touch his bone and flesh, and he'll curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Well, behold, then, he's in your power. Only spare his life." So Satan went from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a potsherd with which to scrape himself, and he sat among the ashes. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women who speak. Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil?" And all that Job did, he didn't sin with his lips. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You know, the book of Job raises one of the more serious theological questions for us. Theologians have sort of batted this ping pong ball back and forth for centuries. The question is called theodicy. Everybody knows it. Theodicy is just simply, why do bad things happen to good people? I think that's something that rests on our heart from time to time. It causes us some distress. But another side of that coin is, why do good things happen to bad people? And I'm wondering if that isn't another side of the same coin that also perplexes us just as much. The book of Job was composed somewhere about 500 years before the time of Jesus. It's in the wisdom literature of ancient Israel, which consists of Job. It consists of the Song of Psalms, Proverbs, Psalms, Ecclesiastes. There are other books as well. But they're aimed at your and my heart to sort of try to give us an appreciation for the life that we have, but also an understanding that in that life there's suffering. Job deals with 3 points. While some suffering is brought upon ourselves for our own sinfulness, some perhaps, maybe even most, according to Job's work here, is undeserved. And to argue that all suffering is kind of brought on by the individual, it kind of undermines the character of individuals. It's like saying everything bad that's happened to you is your fault. It's kind of like Tavier and Fiddler on the Roof. Only Tavier was saying, someone had said to him, you know, to be rich is the curse of all people, in a sense, to crave being wealthy. And Tavier said, well, may I be cursed by that and never recover. I get it. The third thing that Job mentions is, how can God be affirmed as good if you have to deal with why innocent people suffer? He's a blameless and it's an upright man. And in ancient Judaism, every one of us has a guardian angel. And sometime at the conclusion of each day, your guardian angel presents that self before God and gives an account of all the things that you've done and not done. There is no guilt attached to it. There's no reward or praise attached to it. They just simply bring, in a sense, to sort of the context of a courtroom setting, just the facts. It's kind of like Friday and Dragnet, just the facts. Satan was not diabolical. Satan did not have characteristics that will later be developed in Christianity that sort of portray him as a tempter or having an evil component or a component that's not aligned with God's will, but in the book of Job and in much of the Hebrew Bible. Satan is more like, in a sense, a prosecuting attorney who presents himself before the judge. He's also presented as having a very astute theological mind. Satan, in a sense, has presented in his argument about Job a theological question that has hounded us or pursued us for centuries. How do we deal with suffering in this life? Is God responsible for the things that cause human beings to suffer? Is God responsible for all the good things that happen to you in this life? Or is life such a condition or set of conditions that just good things happen, or things that happen that we think of as good, and things that happen that we think of as bad? Calvin tried to understand it. He wrote a little bit about Job, and he said, I've discovered in Job, Calvin wrote, that there are two kinds of fear. And with that, the word fear in the Hebrew Bible really should be translated for us as respect. But Calvin said there is a servile fear. That is to say, most people, and even to Calvin's dismay to some degree, too many people fear God because they think God's going to punish them. True believers, he said, though, ought to be more concerned with respecting God, worrying about offending or going against what's aligned with God's will, as opposed to worrying about whether or not God's going to punish you inevitably. And he said proper fear is just simply respect for God. Job kind of framed it this way: to give God sovereignty, to let God be God, and us to be carbon-based mortals, humans. Shall we not receive from time to time the good along with the bad? Christianity has been a religion for a long time that's been concerned, if not over-concerned in some ways, in its focus on salvation of human beings. That's not to say it's not a component of our faith tradition. But sometimes, as a result of that, it's led you and me to believe that we are the center of all creation. That God made the world purely for the sake of humankind. But has God designed the world in such a fashion that persons always get what we deserve? I find many times when I look at the traditions of Judaism and Christianity that they take me so far, but not always as far as I need to go. For instance, suffering in Judaism, it just simply lays it out there. The more wisdom you have, the more aware you are of the things that are going on in the world, the suffering that's there, and the more you acknowledge it, the more pain and agony it causes you. It brings you grief, and sadness, and despair. The letter of Hebrews said that Jesus learned obedience to God through suffering. Both Judaism and Christianity acknowledge the suffering that goes on in this life. But I find it only acknowledges it. And where I have to go for help is to Buddhism, believe it or not. Because I find that Buddhism tells me how to deal with suffering. One of my daily devotional readings is not just the Christian New Testament. It's not just Psalms or Proverbs or books from the Hebrew Bible that I find inspirational. But I spend a lot of time snuggled up with the writings of the Dalai Lama. I'm really very much interested in his approach to the world. And one of the things that he taught me recently is how to have a positive attitude in the face of all difficulty. For instance, if there is something that some political person has done, and I really just don't like it, perhaps even to the degree that it grieves me, then what Buddhism requires of me, and Christianity as well, but it doesn't always articulate it the same way. It asks me to embrace that person in such a way that I take on myself the very suffering that I see this person causing the world. And what this does is that it reorients me toward a more compassionate mindset, a more accepting mindset that some of these sufferings are there. And there isn't anything I can do about it, specifically myself, other than change how I react or respond or see the situation that brings on the suffering. I release its control on me. It no longer grabs me in the stomach and knots it up with anger or frustration or deep concern. But in a sense, it just allows me to realize that in taking on, in a sense, suffering, which is so much a part of our world, and praying for those who suffer, it takes it away from my personal suffering, and I look and become more concerned with the sufferings of others. In other words, it helps get me outside myself. Christianity acknowledges that too. It writes a prescription for it. It tells us to not be self-centered. Those who seek to preserve or save their personal life status kind of lose it in the grand scheme of things. I think sometimes that the Dalai Lama helps me because he gives me more of step-by-step procedure on a daily basis for how I can embrace a new relationship with all the suffering of the world. You know, Job is a model of God-centered piety, faithfulness. And even though in spite of all of his sufferings, he never complains about his own personal misfortune. Perhaps it was the time in which they grew up. I don't ever remember either my mother or my father, and for sure my grandparents, but even my mother or father, I don't ever remember them complaining about a physical ailment. Even as they aged and even as they got sick, that wasn't the topic of conversation. But I've noticed now when I get around all these other 70-year-olds or 60-something, it's just a matter of time until it all goes, you know, oh, I've got an appointment with the ophthalmologist. I've got an appointment with the gastroenteritis person. And so it goes. And pretty soon you think, God, we're all dying. Well, yeah, but let's talk about something else for a while. But when I think of those previous generations, that when I was a child, I almost hung on every word they said. I just wanted to learn from them. Those weren't topics of conversation because somehow they grew up at a time frame when they just didn't put themselves first in everything. You became more important. I was more important. The neighborhood children around us, our parents invested in their welfare. And other parents were investing in my and others' welfare. Job tells us that part of the enormous power that sometimes suffering can have on us to just shrink our world and our environment to where we don't even leave our bedrooms is a result of just simply thinking about ourselves. The healthiest people I know are those who are invested and involved in the lives of others. Job has some friends who've come up, and they're bringing theological arguments from ancient Judaism because the thought was, if bad things have happened to you in this life, it must have been something that you've done. And it's payback time. before I get to how Job sort of argues with them and sort of releases himself from their theological attack, this particular book, Job, is also in the Quran. But the three people who bring these accusations, criticizing how Job deals with suffering, are not just others in the community. They are Job's brothers. And whereas in Judaism, Job's wife says, well, look, I am so tired of hearing you complain about suffering. Why don't you just go on and curse God and die? Can't take it anymore. Instead of saying that, as is portrayed in the Tanakh in Judaism, the Quran has Job's wife standing by her man. You can sing the song, right? Stand by your man. Okay, well, that's what she did in the Quran. She just said, Job, I know you're right at this. But it also perhaps moves you in the direction of where Islam is taking the male-woman relationship. But that's another story. Turns out, Job wants to say that we have to learn that in the world that's designed by God, suffering is more often than not the consequence of someone's sin, and good things the consequence of some of our virtue that yields happiness. I once heard a person say in the middle of a deep personal crisis, God doesn't owe me anything. Like Job, this person understood that true service to God isn't motivated by what rewards we get from God because we've been a good boy or a good girl. I think the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament is just trying to say to you, hey, you're born into this life. Into pain you entered this life. And there'll be a significant share of it all throughout this life, and to some degree, it's how you and I learn to deal with pain that makes all the difference. The Dalai Lama in Tibet said that suffering is the norm. Even when you think you're happy, it's just that at that particular moment, you're not suffering. I'm not so sure that there's not some truth to that. That if you and I can understand that we're in this together, and so much of what we share in common, we can be responsible toward one another in ways that issue in kindness and in mercy, and sometimes just in human touch. Love, tenderness, healing, forgiveness, mercy. Maybe that's how we respect God. Maybe in the end, that's the kind of wisdom that's born out of a true and proper relationship with God, who's in this with us, unless we've forgotten that he once spent a little while one afternoon hanging on a cross. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.